celebrated architectonical photographer with a long history, photographing really important architects. But one thing we're going to be talking about, rather than that, is some of the interest behind Edmund's lenses. And this exhibit is called Traces. In this idea, he's trying to point out some of the elements that are behind what a regular image has. And those elements refer to the deepness of many things that have already happened in history and in many atmospheric processes during the construction that he's really interested in. Probably I'm not the one who will speak better about this, but it's amazing to have his work here. It's really simple just to catch one of his images and just try to discover all the different layers or traces that are behind each of these images that hopefully he can share with us tonight. So, with you, thank you so much, Edmund Sommer.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Roger and Carlos, for inviting me. It's a great honour. And second of all, I must apologise, my Spanish is terrible. It's literally, it's awful. I kind of joke with people that I like to work in countries where I can't speak the language. And that usually gets a couple of laughs, but people think I'm joking, but really I'm not. Actually, because when I'm photographing, I'm kind of thinking on slightly different levels. I've been photographing architecture for about 25, almost 30 years. And I'm a great believer that architecture is a very powerful conduit of time. Time, energy, memory, and emotion. So tonight I'm going to be showing some slides of some projects that I'm working on. This is a project, the Traces project is something that's probably been going on for about 5 years. But I think actually if I look back in my archive, it's something that threads together very much how I've been thinking for a very, very long time. But it's a real honor in particular to show it in Mexico, but also in this wonderful Hercules establishment. Because there's a lot of coincidence. Sort of creative serendipity is that I didn't really know that Hercules would be an absolute perfect example of the concept of traces, the idea that buildings have got very, very powerful traces of the past. I'm also very interested in re-establishing some polarity between photography and architecture. In the last few years, there's a big move of architects photographing architecture, and of course they're doing really, really beautiful, but it's very, very close, it's very, very tight together. So in some ways, polarity is just about, celebrating and exploring the difference in what we do. The term traces refers to visual representation that might help you think about the past, might help you think about the previous incarnation of the buildings. So moving on. So the first few projects here we've got, on the left we have got Cava Iraqi, which is an expanded quarry above Vicenza, which is a very obvious representation of the idea of traces. You have etchings on the ceiling, on the walls, so you can sort of judge time. In the middle it was a hacienda in Merida, which actually was very much the genesis of this project, because I was working with the architects Reyes Rios Herrera, I think around 2017, and their client had commissioned me to photograph a hacienda complex, which they were slowly converting into a hotel and a wedding venue, sort of thing. But it was so vast that it had quite a lot of buildings that were sort of in the very early stages of the process. And I was very intrigued by how they asked me to spend 3 days photographing the space, but then two days literally to think about history and to find images that really alluded to the past. So it's a very significant project. On the right, we we have a project that's relatively recent. There's a developer client of mine in England who's probably some to know kind of developer, and he had bought a barn almost 20 years ago, and was trying to get planning permission so he could make it into a house. So he wanted me to look at it with those optics. So if we go back to biblical times, you will find that there's many references to the idea of writings on the wall. And the writings on the wall can be a warning, it can be a graffiti, or it can be such as this, with some sort of divine intervention. So these are actually examples that I found yesterday, just walking around the town and walking around Hercules. Just wonderful, happy little scenes, and I sort of put them together, and I think the power in them is sort of with juxtaposition of the two. This obviously little scene is just across the road. Whether it's a happy scene or a sad scene is a little bit hard to tell, but there we go. So I think really it's interesting. The majority of you all will be architects, and in some ways, your work is going to outlast you by some considerable time. Really, we're here for a very short time, very short time, and it's a case of, I think it's a human desire to try and leave a trace, to try and leave some sort of impression of yourself. This could be through a great body of work, it could be a charitable donation or foundation, or it could be sort of graffiti. So as a child, there's this sort of desire to sort of mark your territory, to mark space, mark your environment, and those are very sort of simplistic examples of traces. Another one would be, let's say you go to a prison museum, or perhaps, like in my case, when I was a kid, we moved house and I went up to the attic and I found some writing, I think like 100 years before. But these sort of things, they happen all the time. There was one photographer who was very significant to me in that he was this photographer called Simon Norfolk. Simon Norfolk is a very intelligent, very eccentric British photographer who got sent out to Afghanistan in the early 90s. And when he went out, he was sort of trying to work out, what he wanted to do, what his creative development was going to be. And he came up with a solution that you didn't actually know what you want to do. You work out what you don't want to do. So, for example, around that time, your typical war photographer would be running around with a flak jacket, 2 cameras, huge lenses, really, pumped up on different things, including ego, running around, getting images. So he was very different. He was sort of researching Afghanistan and found out they had this very long tradition of street photography, but old-fashioned bellows cameras that would be, taken for portraits. So he decided, first of all, that was the sort of camera he was going to use. And then second of all, he became very interested in photographing architecture and using the architecture as a sort of greatest sort of the zeitgeist of the historical time. So this picture, you'd be forgiven for thinking it's quite boring. He shot this and won quite a lot of awards. And so, if we look at it and we unpick it, and we look at the traces, so to speak, it's a stairway. The treads have been worn down. And it's not even a particularly well-composed picture. It's sort of okay, there's quite a lot of foreground, there's quite a lot, not quite enough top. And then, you look at it, but it's only when you hear, actually, this picture is the central stairwell at Auschwitz, that you realise quite the horror of what he's showing. Because you start to, through his skill in picking up the traces of the past, you immediately interact, you think. Your mind is sort of taken on a journey. So with his work, I just became more and more interested. And then I went to a lecture by Simon, and he was showing a lot of architectural buildings. This is the Herat Palace in Herat, funnily enough. And he was explaining about how historians have long used architecture to date conflict and to date time. So, you know, as you know, Afghanistan, they love fighting, and they've been fighting since, I think in the late 70s and the early 80s, you have the Russian invasion. And the Russian invasion can be seen by very, very small sort of polka dots, sort of like on the edges, very, very small. So that would have been sort of AK-47, street fighting. Then later on, you had the Taliban versus the Northern Alliance, and that would have been all about RPGs. So RPGs would have been much bigger, there would be much bigger sort of things, taking out whole swathes of the buildings. Then finally you had the Americans, and the Americans would just come in with a sort of iron fist and take out whole sides of buildings. So I began to find this very interesting idea about tracing time. And then, you know, again, obviously, as you will be familiar with, the Taliban banned music and they banned cinema. So, you know, you've got this very sort of axial, very sort of deadpan shot, but in a very similar way, he's using architecture as a sort of conduit of history, which is really very interesting. So the next picture is by a photographer called Karam Al-Masari. Karam was and this is a picture taken in the Arab Spring in Aleppo. Now, Karam didn't actually even study to be a photographer, he was studying to be a lawyer. And then during the Arab Spring, you know, the universities got closed down, and he began to go to some of the protests and just to take pictures on iPhones. And you know, then he got more and more and more interested in this picture. When I saw it, I immediately froze, because when I was growing up in London, when I was probably 10 or 12, there was the Yugoslav crisis, the Civil War. So immediately, when you look at this picture, I knew immediately what this picture was about. Those pictures, so you have, with the Civil War, often what happens, you have the two sides going closer and closer and closer, until they're literally about a kilometre or half a kilometre apart, and then it becomes the War of the Fleet, the War of Snipers. So this, I knew immediately, reminded me of in Sarajevo, there was the infamous sniper ants. They dug trenches, they had carcasses and white sheets, so people could get through no man's land. This is the same. But you know, looking at this, why is this different from a typical war picture? Is that there's time. The guy is in no hurry, so obviously he knows the area. He's not scared. He's not running around like a typical sort of G.I. Joe type ego-driven photographer. He is taking a lot of time, and I think because of that, the picture for me has a lot of raw emotion. So actually I managed to get in contact with Karam and he sold me a print of it and talked long and hard about the picture and its meaning. Moving on, there's another project. I have been doing a lot of work in Japan over the years, and this is Japan after the storm, which is after the triple tragedy of the tsunami, nuclear disaster, and the earthquake. And it was something I pitched to Domus and Architecture Review, and the idea of my story was to, there were some architects like Toyo Ito and Fujimoto, they were making, because there was a lot of displacement of people, they put in these temporary sort of villages and centres, and you know, fine, but just quite dull. So they were making little community centres. But funnily enough, I started doing that, and then I began to feel very cynical. It just felt like sort of disaster and architect work. And I began to be much more interested in what wasn't there, what was the trace sort of left behind. So you can see, sort of, tsunamis are a very, very strange thing. They sort of come in and raise everything. The actual solid infrastructure will still be there. So you can see the roads. And Japan has a very complicated relationship with the past, a bit like a very complicated relationship with nature. They want to discuss it and look at it and it all to be very pretty, but they don't really want it to be that real. So with the tsunami, they were just wanting to clear everything. They wanted to clear it and they were wanting to rebuild.
The devastating tsunami following the great earthquake claimed many lives. But in the town of Minamisandiku in Miyagi Prefecture, about 10,000 residents were saved thanks to the effort of one woman. As the tsunami approached, Miki Endo, a staff worker at the town hall, warned residents over the community loudspeaker system, but she remains unaccounted for.
A huge tsunami hit Minamisandiku. There was an announcement that a tsunami was approaching. A woman's voice could be heard on the loudspeaker across the town.
So, as you might have heard from that, Miki Endo was a municipal worker, and this building here is the Tsunami Early Warning Center. Her number one job, her number one role was to scan for tsunamis, and then on the roof to be manning a microphone just to warn everyone what was coming. So she sort of became, let's say, Miki Endo, the voice of an angel. You can see one of the prints over there. So when we visited, I became very interested in how this building was still there. And I think it was like a little bit too difficult for them to move, because a lot of Japanese houses are very lightweight and wood, and so they were very easily taken apart. Whereas this was bolted into the concrete because of the virtue of its role, let's say, to protect, to warn against tsunamis. So it was also very interesting in an architectural way, and very interesting in terms of relationship with history. Because as I said, Japan has this relationship with history. They're very uncomfortable with it. They want to be sort of seen in a nice light, but after some time. Whereas here, people started turning up with flowers and started crying, and it was very un-Japanese. So there was a lot of concern about what to do. And then I think as soon as they got on the media, then they decided they had to make it into a museum, which I think it has been. But you can see the real ferocity of it. And again, sort of segueing back into this idea of visual traces. You can see, you can feel the energy and the ferocity more than some more sort of cliched images for what you can expect. So when I was a kid in London, there were not so many cars. Not that I'm that old, by the way, but like we don't have cars, just not many, because London was a bit poor and cars weren't a thing. And because of that, street play was a big thing. Football, running around, hopscotch, all these games, it was all good fun. And one of the big things was chalk. Everyone would do chalk and things. And during the pandemic in London, everything stopped. Everything froze. And being photographers, everyone was running around trying to get the image, what was the definitive image of the pandemic. Everyone seemed to be convinced that it was about empty streets or empty subways or empty this. And I was always quite disappointed by that, because it didn't really say anything. I like the idea of streets being empty. It ain't no thing for me. What really struck me was how kids started playing on the streets again. And I was seeing these little things everywhere. And some of them were scared me, to be honest. Because it's like, these poor kids, you're like, you're trying to protect the children but they know what's going on, they know something strange. So there are these very, very strange little symbols that were turning up everywhere. And, I think it's this sort of idea of when you start to look, when you start to really, really look and think, you start to see things all the time. It's quite interesting. The next, I want to talk about another photographic hero of mine. There's a Japanese photographer called Sugimoto. And Sugimoto, again, had a very similar idea about architecture, motion, time. His sort of target, so to speak, was cinemas and quite old cinemas. And he had a very technical process of always producing a massive 10 by 8, and the exposure was always the length of the film, which is quite difficult to work out. Let's say you're watching The Exorcist or something, and it's 1 hour, 50 minutes, then you need to work out technically how to do that with filters. But it's a very sort of sanguine sort of scenes. I think, for me, I find myself really just thinking about, the emotion and the spirit of these spaces and the history, I guess. So this, I think, is in New Orleans. I think this is the same car park that was in, I don't know if you've seen it's called 8 Mile with Eminem. They have like a rap battle in this car park. So, this is my attempt at cinema. But this is, I do a lot of work in India, and I have done for about 25 years. And everyone was always asking me how I photographed the Corbusier cinema in Chandigarh, and as I was saying, I hadn't. And it became a bit of a quest, a bit of a holy grail, really, because I couldn't even find any pictures of it. But I knew the name, and so I was in Chandigarh on a job, and then I went to I just looked up the phone book, the internet showed up. There was the Chandigarh, there was Neelam Cinema, and it was a very sort of, sanguine, very sort of happy, sad space, a bit like Sugimoto's, because, you're there, you're interacting with the spirit of the past. And, I think at one stage this is, the language of brave modernity and optimism, and it's still sort of beautiful, probably to most of the people in this room would think it's beautiful, but the general public would probably think it's quite disgusting. I mean, here, you could probably plant a mushroom in there, and it would start growing, but it's just got this incredible energy. So, and I with the manager of the cinema, I said, sure, I could take pictures, that was fine, but only during the changeover in films. And Hindi films are about 3 hours long. Changeover is 20 minutes. So I was there for pretty much 2 days just to get a few little shots. But I'm quite proud of this picture. London was obviously heavily bombed during the war. We got heavily bombed by the Germans, and we heavily bombed them. It was a bomb fest, really. And but what was quite interesting is that there were some decisions taken with this Victoria and Albert Museum to preserve the polka dots, the shrapnel marks, and I think much, but not with any huge virtue signaling kind of thing. It's just left as a reminder of the past. And then you're brought on to the work of David Chipperfield, who's one of the most powerful architects of the time. And this is his sort of renovation of the New Orleans Museum. And it's sort of interesting because how does architecture celebrate the past, acknowledge the past, but without sort of just making it a replica, like so for example in Japan you would have replicas, the Osaka castle, it's like just as it would have been, but it's brand new, it's changed every few years. So and I think with that there's just some very, very subtle interventions, and then there's also the work of Julia Harp, who was his historic architect. So I mentioned earlier about how both Mexico and in particular this one commission and Hacienda Hall were quite significant in the formulation of this project. So this is the Hacienda Hall, and for 2 days I was asked to just explore find things. And to be honest, it became really quite emotional, because you're looking at this place and I kept sort of thinking about the past and the atmosphere of what would have happened there. And, you made really, really great pictures, but I sort of kept sort of coming back to the idea of how do I visually unpick the past? How do I sort of celebrate it? Because, you know, essentially you're trying to show something that's not actually there. The past is the past, we're in the present. So how does one do that? And I think then I really began to sort of home in on the idea of sort of certain visual clues, traces. So, yeah, this was one room that had been sort of taken over by swans. Kind of crewing everywhere. And then there was a worker playing some beautiful piano music, and yeah, just the emotion of space just was fantastic. So then moving on to the chapel. This is quite a sort of straightforward example of a visual trace. This is the chapel. You can see the polka dots and the sun fading on the walls. And I think probably the power of this image, I think, is that you're wondering sort of what's around the corner there. What's kind of, yeah, slightly sanguine, and obviously had better days, but still incredibly beautiful, I think. Then this is in Plantel Matilda, which is a summer resident Village Arts Centre for Javier Marin. And again, we've got more swallows. So I want to talk about a commission for David Chipperfield Architects, and this was Cava Araki, which was above Vicenza, and this is an expanded stone quarry. There are 3 big families that seem to have sort of called the market in stone. This was one of the big ones. They've got 4 big quarries. This one has been extended. I mean, it was absolutely beautiful to photograph. And I kind of, you know, wanted to show the architecture, but not, you know, too much. I wanted to show it in its space. And I also like to use the figure. This is my assistant Ken, just as a sort of idea of interaction, or I guess putting on a bit of scale. You know, very beautiful. And I think I've got I don't know if it's the same in Mexico, but at the moment in UK, there's a huge move towards structural stone. Using steel, using beams made out of stone, you know, which I'm told is both safe and economic and environmental, which is great. But friends who are in that world were explaining to me all the different ways they could date these spaces. And you can see, but up here, I've actually sort of got things that you guys sort of signed them. So we're moving on to another building, again by David Chipperfield. And I particularly wanted to show this one because I think I'm sort of talking a lot about historic buildings and how they have atmospheres of the past and how they, you know, sort of instill emotion. But I think it doesn't have to, sometimes you come across buildings that are new, that really still conjure up feelings of memory, feelings of very strong emotion. This is the Inagawa Cemetery Complex. So obviously it's emotionally a very loaded space. It's, you know, all about death and passing on into the other spaces. But I was sort of taken very much by this particular corridor, and I just kept noticing about how the different times of day had different moods, different atmospheres. And I actually went back the next day, literally focusing on this one corridor. And then, for me, the sort of power of it is in sort of juxtaposing the images. And I've sort of retro-analysed this so many times. I think some of the things someone could say might be seen as comical or might be seen as poetic. I mean, either is fine. But for me, on the left, you've got day, on the right, you've got light, and then you've got natural, and you've got artificial. You've got life, you've got death, you've got good, you've got evil. All of that in sort of one series of pictures. And then there's a very, very simple look at the main prayer halls. So here we've got two projects. One is by Italo Hector Moreso in Valle de Bravo, and then one is by AT&T in Japan. One was taken in 2006, and one was taken in 24. But what I find really sort of quite interesting is with both of them, there is a sort of celebration of tradition and modernity in one way. I think with Hector Moreso, I think of it as like Earth on Earth. It's like almost like it's a sort of thing. So you've got what is it when you press into walls on the top, and then you've got volcanic stones being made into a wall. And then you've just got huge, great volcanic rocks on the bottom. So, and I quite like showing these sort of together because I think they're framing something that I find quite interesting. So this is near me in London, and this is my wife Yuki from Japan, who puts up a lot of my photographic adventures, and. This is quite interesting because my local station, which is Peckham Bryan, it was designed by Sir Charles Henry Driver in 1874, and he decided that there needed to be 2 waiting rooms, but he wasn't very, very good at maths, and actually really they only needed 1. So the second one never really particularly got used. This is the second one, and then it got turned into a billiard hall. Disco, and then I think in the 70s the disco got a bit of a reputation and it got closed down and sort of boarded up. So a local sort of architecture as a community group have brought the building out of habitation, so to speak. So all the plaster was taken off the ceiling, so there was sort of collapse, and it's just sort of left in this wonderful sort of raw carcass of the shell. And when you're here, when you're walking, I've spent quite a lot of time here, there's just little symbols, little signs of previous inclinations that, for me, are quite powerful. And the thing about these inclinations and these ideas of the past is like, they don't necessarily have to be true. And that's kind of okay, because it's just the idea is that they make you dream, I think. This was quite interesting. I was the official photographer for the Architecture Biennale in Sharjah in 2013. And I don't know if many of you know of Sharjah, I certainly didn't. It's one of the Arab Emirates, but it's one of the sort of very intellectual Arab Emirates. So it's not like, it's the opposite of Dubai. So the ruler's daughter is very, very highly regarded curator. So it was all about sort of celebration of impermanence and the celebration of imperfection, and the idea that actually these buildings have got a huge loaded emotion and history. This particular building is the Central Mall, which was being developed in the early noughties, and then I think the developer ran out of money and then disappeared, to be seen again, and the building has just been left like this. And then there's a sort of intervention by a studio from Africa called Iraqi. Yeah, and I'm very fond of this picture. I just love this guard because he's just sort of utterly confused by what I'm doing and why. Yeah, so sometimes I make little videos. They're short, a bit trippy. They might communicate something. So this is the Royal Festival Hall, which was a building as a much beloved cultural institution. It's one, I mean, I know that's one of those things that people say about cultural institutions, but this one really, really is. People are very, very fond of it. It's on the road. It was built just after World War II. It was completed in 18 months, and it's coming up for the 75th anniversary. And for the 75th anniversary, they decided that they were going to commission a new book, and I was one of the photographers I invited to make a proposal for it. And I think that my idea, really, how I think I got involved in the project, first of all, they had seen an exhibition I had on traces, the idea of celebrating imperfection and architecture as a conduit of time. So they invited me to come and talk about maybe doing a book, and then so I sort of told them a sort of story a little bit about what the building meant to me, and is that my late father, who was an architect, used to take me to the Royal Festival Hall to see classical music. And back then, I mean, London was quite rough, really. This was in the early 80s. You had tramps and hobos hanging outside. You know, these are not, hipster tramps, these are proper, sooty faces and hats and fires. And, for a 10-year-old kid, it was kind of, it made quite an impression on one's mind. And then, so he would take me to this hall, and it sort of, he would sort of subject me to really intense classical music. And so I was sort of sitting in this space, and I didn't really understand or appreciate either the architecture or the music, but I could tell that it was significant. So, I kind of thought a lot about it. And when I was there, I was always obsessed by the organ. It was a massive great organ, and I was just being a kid. I was like, right, I want to play in there. I want to go to the back. And so my proposal really was about how, because this is such a sort of, I think to sort of photograph the building through the eyes of a child being me, and sort of also to sort of look back at the audience rather than sort of glamorous shots of the building and its beauty, kind of like, give the building back to the people, so to speak. Again, so I work a lot in India. This is the Temple of Steps. It's a project I work a lot with an architect called Sunil Padura, and absolutely stunning project. And it's, here I'm beginning to use video a little bit more and sound, and I'm really interested in capturing, the emotion of the space. Just very, very simple, hovering above a little road. So this is my penultimate slide. This I shot yesterday, actually, from a flight from Merida to Mexico City, and there was a lot of tension in the air, as you will be aware of. But whenever I come to Mexico, I'm just so taken with lots of beauty everywhere. And I sort of try and capture it in different ways. And this was just a very little simple. Right, and then this is my last one. And this is I think there was one particular year in 23, 24 when yeah, there was a very emotional year. I was putting off in a lot of things, and you know, I put them together into a little reel. That concludes the show. Thank you very much for your time.
We open space for. Okay, hope that doesn't happen again. Okay, we open the space for any interventions, any questions, any regards or comments are welcome.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I think it's really inspiring. Hola. Okay. Your work is really inspiring, and it definitely goes beyond the photo. It goes beyond the image when you're presenting to us. How are you? Okay. So basically, what we've seen today is there's a lot of knowledge and reflection behind the images that you showed us, and that's something that you don't really see when a photographer presents its job, and I really appreciate that, because it's quite inspiring. My question is, when you don't know, when you have a commission and you have a new project and you basically don't know much about it, how would you approach that project? Do you usually visit? Do you usually try to find a reason, or try to find something else beyond aesthetics about about your work. That's basically because what I've seen is it's quite profound or quite deep. So my question is how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I consider, I think if people can sort of feel the atmosphere of the space, the intention inside and behind it, I'll consider it a success. I think it's very important to differentiate between very strongly personal work and commissioned work. I mean, here there is a mixture of the two. I think it's a blessing and a curse that there isn't that much difference between commissioned and uncommissioned work. I think I'd probably be more commercially successful if it was more overtly commercial, the work. I think so. On that said, I think if one was shooting to commission, you would treat it in a slightly different way. But essentially, you're looking for the same thing. You're looking for the emotion, the creative DNA of a project. And the problem is sometimes it's not there. Again, so when it's a professional, so one would record and present the space in the best way possible. But let's say, for example, if one was commissioned to photograph Hercules, I mean, it would be not difficult to think through the optics of sort of traces and history, and I think it would be quite a powerful sort of synergy. But again, I think the idea that I mentioned to you at lunch, I'm a photographer, but firstly, I'm very interested in architecture, but I'm not an architect. I think sometimes when you're speaking with architects, they start talking architecture. You have to say, look, I'm not an architect. And it's very important because I think it's in all things in life, having polarity is important. We are different. We see things differently. So I think that I'm on a bit of a mission to really celebrate that difference. And I think a good photographer will expand and bring new ideas to a project that perhaps the architect hasn't envisaged. Because in some ways, what a good photographer does is that he provides the architect with psychological closure. So, for example, you might get a phone call in 2022. Someone wants to have a wonderful new museum or a house. It's beautiful. The project is born, and But by the end, I hear so many stories that the project is dead. They've fallen out of the cloud. There's no budget. All the wonderful bits that they had have gone. All that love has disappeared. So really, the photographer's job is to bring it back to life. So it's almost like a rebirth if it's done well.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. All your photos are amazing. I have two questions. The first one is, in your experience, what does photography stop being a job and start becoming a passion? Is it defined by intention, by freedom, or by the way you regulate the act of looking? And in the same line, I wonder how technical limitations such as working exclusively with analog film, where each frame is finite, might influence that relationship. I mean, we as photographers have a lot of shots or a lot of opportunities to take a moment. When you have to capture just one moment, how that limitation would change the way you take your photographies or the way you look for search for a moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when it stops to become a job, I think is when you wake up in the middle of the night and you're thinking about a particular way or something you might be able to do. You might be able to do a little bit better. I think it's when it becomes an obsession. It's when it becomes an itch that you don't want to stop scratching. It's sort of, it's just something that drives you on. Photography is not difficult, technically. It's very, very easy. Anyone can do it, really. But what is difficult is the idea behind the picture, the concept of the picture. And I think with architectural photographers, the thing that differentiates the good from the average is that anyone can record a space. You come in and there's axial plumb lines, down. I think the good photographers will do that, but they will also interpret the space. They will analyze the space. They will present it in a way that makes sense technically, but also explains the design intention of the designer.
Well, first of all, congratulations or maybe like this. Okay. Okay, I'll try that. Well, first of all, congratulations. I really admire your work. It's no. What I'm trying, I was thinking it's about the traces that you talk about are like these traces in time that are like perceptible in things, like the benches, like I don't know, the architecture, the spaces, the query. But in this space, I saw that in Mexico, the ones that were being made, the London shows are about landscapes. So it's like this perception of Mexico. Is it that I think that traces in Mexico are more interesting into the landscapes rather than other spaces? Or how do you find more interesting, or I don't know, just coincidence? It's like, what are the places you find in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really quite a brilliant question, and it's very, very astute of you to ask that. And I think they are landscapes, but I think they are historical and emotional landscapes. I think one of the things that always strikes me about Mexico is its relationship with its past, both sort of real and unreal. So in terms of relationship with the sort of spirituality of the past, with old traditions and old religions that are sort of, celebrated, but they're not over. It's not finished. And I think in terms of the landscapes, I think there's a very interesting relationship